Okay, now let's go over the language and content of science. Okay, so science is a very unique and special case because it can have some very technical language associated with the content. And the way in which we think about information in science is very different than the way that we sort of approach information in math and language arts and social studies. Okay, so students' language in science is going to center on description because usually what we're doing in science is making discoveries, we're analyzing data, we're stating hypotheses, we're running experiments, we're going to report results, and students are usually required to make conclusions from those results. So all of those steps of inquiry that we do in science is very different to the type of way that we learn in other content areas. Okay, so again, the content and language objectives of the lessons are going to be much different than what you would see in other areas. And it's important that we take into consideration that there's going to be a skill that is involved in the lesson, as well as the way that we want students to use language to showcase that skill. Okay, so here's an example of a language and content objective from science. The content objective would be use a scientific instrument as part of scientific inquiry to make accurate measurements. So you can tell that in this lesson, the whole purpose would be for students to understand and to showcase their ability to use an instrument during an experiment. The language objective is very, very separate to that, very different, okay? But it's equally as important, if not more important, which is describe the observations of that experiment, orally or in writing, as part of that scientific inquiry. So not only are you having students use the instrument, which would be that content objective, but you have to teach students the way in which to describe their observations of the use of that instrument in order to showcase their ability, right? And both pieces are as important as each other. Imagine if you were just to focus on the content objective in a lesson, in a lesson such as that. Okay, so you might show students how to use the instrument, and you might be able to observe them using the instrument correctly. But when it comes down to the point where you're asking them to describe their use of that instrument, they're going to be left sort of in the dark and not have the appropriate terms and the appropriate sentence structures and vocabulary in which to describe what they're doing. Okay, so two parts are essential to teach. So we know that the structure, style, and presentation of scientific information can be a challenge for ELLs because it's highly technical and much different to what they've learned before. And so as a teacher of science, or if you happen to be covering anything to do with inquiry, you should really go about introducing, reinforcing, and reviewing each of the steps that go with inquiry. Okay. Whenever possible, use authentic and real-life supports so that students can make connections and learn vocabulary, but not just vocabulary, so the sort of the associations of that experiment with real-life applications. Also, what is a really good aspect, or what is a really good part of this would be to have students transfer the information that they're deriving, right, into tables, into charts where the numbers and the information is displayed without language. Okay, what that does is to make sure that students understand how they derived that information, those numerical aspects, from the language, and also it gives them a support again when they're asked to then write up their results or describe their results, right? Because they have that table with the numbers available for them to support then their writing. This of course reduces their dependence on the print. You always want to pre-teach the technical terms and the language patterns in English. This is sort of similar to how what we discussed in the math language, right? And of course differentiate your instruction or your expectations for different students depending on their language proficiency. So the beginner students who may not be able to write out an extensive sentence, you may want to give them some ways in which to tell you, either through multiple choice or through shorter ways of describing their answers to you, how sort of their results on the question or on the scientific inquiry report or whatever it is. So in other words, students who are at a higher English language proficiency, you can sort of push and have them write out their own answers. Students who are at a lower English proficiency, you can construct the answers for them, have them choose the answer, or provide them with an example sentence that they can use as a support to insert or to create their own result, their own response. Okay. So here's another example. So the first set of questions is intended for younger students or those with lower levels of English language proficiency. And notice how these prompts are very short and very specific, right? Find the problem, check it out, make the observations, ask a question, look for the answer, describe what you have, explain what happened. Notice that below in the parentheses you have the more academic language, the more technical language, right? Observation, identify the problem, hypothesis, analyze data, right? And that's important too, so that students, along with the easier version, they're still seeing the academic language, the more technical version, so that they slowly become familiar with that and are hopefully in the future able to carry out the inquiry based on just the academic language itself. Okay, and then the second set is the second set right here, the identify the problem. That would be for the older or more proficient English language learners. Okay, so let's get into our second activity, and what this is are a list of content objectives that represent different levels of proficiency for English language learners. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is arrange the tasks according to their appropriateness for students of different proficiency levels. And you can see that the levels that I want you to think about are entering, emerging, developing, expanding, and bridging. So those students who are in the entering level are going to be at the lowest proficiency, where they would need a lot more support, right? Versus the bridging, students who are at the level 5 are going to be those that are basically fluent in English and are about at the level of their English-speaking peers. So what I'd like you to do is we can actually read through these together. And I'd like you to pay attention to the types of supports that are integrated into each of these objectives and think about which would be more appropriate for a student who's in entering versus a student who's in the bridging. Okay, so describe in detail the stages of life cycles using illustrations and graphic organizers. Okay, so illustrations and graphic organizers here are the support. Reproduce stories about the stages of life cycles using illustrations. Okay, so now this would be describe in detail versus reproduce stories. So we can tell that the reproduce stories would include more writing, more language. Okay, and we can also see that the support, the using illustrations, and the graphic organizers, here in this one, the using illustrations would be alone, right? There's no graphic organizer as a support in this objective here. So immediately we can tell that the level here is a lower level than what would be represented here in that second objective, because there is more language involved and less support. Okay, next one would be label drawings, and the supports would be an illustrated word bank and a graphic organizer. Next one would be describing the stages of life cycles, using again two supports, illustrated word banks and graphic organizers. And the last objective would be produce simple sentences, using again two supports, illustrated word banks and graphic organizers. So your task is to figure out which levels these represent. They're not in order. You should be using your information about how much language is involved and how many supports are given to figure out if it would be appropriate for a level 1 or a level 5 student, and anything in between. You can find the document that contains this activity in the unit where you're watching this video. If you go down to the activities section, it should be activity 2, the language and content of science. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of moments. You can pause the video. We'll come back and talk through it. Okay, so the first one would be, actually I'm going to show you all of them. So this would be level 1, because all we're expecting students to do is label the drawings. which you can imagine labeling requires just one word, one or two words. Also, we can see that students have two different supports here, okay, to do that. So this would allow a student who is at the entering level of proficiency to engage in an on-grade level content objective about showing their knowledge around this particular science piece, okay. The second level would be producing simple sentences, because that would be just one more level of language. Still, you can see the two supports in place. The third one would be describing the stages of life cycles, which obviously requires a little bit more language, but you still have those two supports in place. The fourth one would be describing in detail the stages of life cycles, because now you see that added level of language. Okay, and then the fifth one would be reproducing stories about the stages of life cycles using illustrations. This is number 5 because, as I said before, you have the most amount of language that these students have to actually reproduce their own stories. So you're talking about a paragraph of more of their own language, and you've also taken away one support. So now they're going off of just an illustration. Okay, let's try that one again. Let's do another type of the similar activity. Okay, so I want you to read through these and use the same sorts of thinking to figure out which would be a level 1 and which would be a level 5 type of task. Okay, think about the amount of language that's required and think about the number of supports that are provided in the content objectives. Okay, so let's go through it together. Okay, I'll show you the levels. So here, this would be level 1 because we have describing the effects of the modifying variable. We have two supports here. We have an illustrated word bank, and the fact that this is happening in small groups means that you can put the English language learner with others who speak English as a support, and that together they would be coming up with these descriptions. So it wouldn't be, even though there is quite a good amount of language involved here, it wouldn't be the sole responsibility of that English language learner by themselves. Number 2 is give examples of the effects of modifying a variable. Here we see using illustrations and sentence frames in small groups. The give examples is actually a cognitive level above just describing the effects, because now it is more application based, so that's why it represents number 2. Number 3, here we see explaining, right? So now, again, the cognitive level is up 1 because the student has to be able to understand and be able to communicate that understanding to others. But again, notice how you have your supports in place, which is still very appropriate for the entering, emerging, and developing proficiency levels of ELLs. Number 4 would be discuss the effects of a modifying variable using sentence frames and graphic organizers. So here, discussing the effects, usually oral language and spontaneous oral language, in a formal environment where students are expected to be using academic language, that represents sort of a higher level, something that we would expect a student that's either level 4 or 5 to be able to do. And number 5, report on the effects of a modifying variable in small groups. Here now we are expecting students to be able to represent that information in a particular structure, right, a report that matches the scientific inquiry structure that we are expecting students to use in science. And it would require a lot more writing in the academic dialect, right, the academic register. And notice how there are no longer any sorts of supports other than just a small group who would be doing this together. Okay, you may have given these different levels, and that's okay as long as you're able to justify it, and as long as it makes sense with regard to how much language you're expecting students to produce and how many supports they're given to do that. Okay, so those are the 2 factors that I really want you to think about when we think about differentiating content objectives for English language learners versus other students, and also for English language learners depending on their proficiency level.